By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority? That's the question that is asked of Jesus today. And to be honest, I have a list of people to whom I would like to address those very questions. How about you? It seems to me that underlying much of our anxiety in our country right now is this central question: who has authority? Who has the authority to say that an election is fair? Who has the authority to tell me to wear a mask or get vaccinated? Of course, it's important to understand that questions of authority inevitably lead to motives. Why do police pull over Black drivers more frequently than white ones? Why are men paid higher wages than women for similar work? Why is no one working on a comprehensive immigration policy? Suspicions about authority are not new, but they may actually be worse right now than they have been in the last 50 years. Because according to the Gallup poll, institutional authority has been on the decline. In 1973, 65% of Americans had either a great deal or quite a lot of faith in organized religion. Today, that number is 32%. In 1973, 45% of Americans had confidence in the Supreme Court. Today, that number is 27%. Congress had 42% confidence in 1973. Today, only 8% of Americans have confidence in Congress. Across the board, confidence in American institutions is at an all-time low. Without people in authority who we trust and believe are accountable to us and our communities, and without institutions that we trust and believe to be accountable, it's hard to have faith that our best interests are being looked after. And when that trust is eroded, every problem becomes a crisis. Every conversation becomes an argument. Every new idea is seen as an existential threat. We are not the first generation or the first culture to face such a moment. People have been losing faith in authority as long as there have been people and authority. In the first reading we heard today, we're reminded that Moses, the great prophet and leader of Hebrew scriptures, was constantly having his motives questioned and his authority undermined. Remember, Moses has just delivered the Hebrew people out of slavery. He's leading them to the promised land. These are God's chosen people. And in chapter 17, they are thirsty and crossing the desert and ask Moses, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and livestock?" If this sounds familiar, it is most probably because the Hebrew people are constantly asking Moses if he is trying to kill them, while he is leading them to prosperity and freedom. Jesus is wrestling with similar issues of authority. Today's reading actually comes from the events of Palm Sunday and Holy Week. Jesus has ridden his donkey into Jerusalem to prepare for the Passover. Meanwhile, the Romans, who have military control over the region, have increased their presence. There are soldiers everywhere. The temple authorities are fearful that violence could erupt at any time. And Jesus comes into the temple and overturns the tables of the money changers. In other words, Jesus disrupts the peace in a moment in which everyone is on edge. The chief priests respond in that moment with our question, the question. By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you that authority? Jesus frames his response on the idea that there are two kinds of authority: human authority and divine authority. Thomas Long, in his commentary on Matthew, writes about this passage. First, there is human authority. No matter how it is packaged, human authority is a matter of raw power. If you have enough people behind you or guns with you, you have it, and what you say goes, period. Divine authority, he writes, has to do with truth, the truth of God, the truth about who God made us to be. In the short run, human authority can appear to overwhelm divine authority, even to crucify it. But ultimately, God's truth prevails. Faith, Christian faith, is shaped around the belief that truth, God's truth, the truth of the goodness of God's creation, will prevail. There's a story about a young minister. He had just graduated from seminary and was serving a little church in a very small town. This story comes from a time around the early part of the last century. He had only been there a couple of weeks when he received the call to do his first funeral. The person who had died wasn't a member of his church, and so he began asking around in this small town to find out more about her. She was, in fact, a woman with a very bad reputation. She ran a rooming house and rented to men who worked on the railroad. And there were rumors that she rented more than just rooms. The young preacher couldn't find a single person who had anything good to say about this woman, and he had to preach her funeral the very next day. So we went into the little grocery store in the little town, and he began to talk to the owner about how worried he was about his first funeral and how he had seemed to have the first person he had ever known in that little town that nobody had anything good to say about. The store owner just listened, and then he went in the back and he brought out the store ledger and laid it on the counter between him and the preacher. He opened the ledger up at random and covered the names of the people with his left hand, and he pointed to the grocery bills written in red, groceries that people had bought on credit, and then the column that said that the bill had been paid. He said, every month that woman would come in and ask me who was behind on their grocery bills. It was usually someone who was dealing with sickness or death, or some poor woman who was trying to feed her kids when her husband drank up the money. That woman would pay their bill and made me swear never to tell. But I figure now that she's gone, people ought to know, especially since the ones who are talking bad about her are the very ones she helped. Human authority is powerful. It affects us. It has the power to make our lives more or less comfortable. Congress can shut down the government. The Supreme Court can give or take away legal rights. The church can reflect God's love and mercy, or it can use its power to judge, to shame, to enrich itself. Human authority is neutral, but corruptible. As people of faith, we believe that goodness, that acts of kindness and generosity, of mercy and compassion, are signs of divine authority. And we are in a moment in which we need bold acts of grace, heroic goodness, and prophetic mercy. Anxiety and fear whisper to us that we are alone and must look out for ourselves, put our own interest first. But genuine truth, loving compassion, remind us that we are part of God's family, bound together by faith, love, honesty, and hope. Amen.
Yea, the sparrow